Dr. Jordan. So we do it every day here. We call it The Big Story. And here is the big story. It's the biggest story in my life, and it's the biggest story for a lot of people in my vortex. And to be honest, it's national news because I peeled this off the Canadian Press Sports Wire. Jim Hopson, the former Saskatchewan Roughriders player who later served as president of the CFL club, has died. He was 73. Clark, can you do me a favor? And this is on me. Can you Google a photo, and we'll throw it up here in a second for those that don't know. The Roughriders confirmed Jim's death today. He battled colon cancer for the past 3 years. Jim Hopson, a Regina, Saskatchewan product, was an offensive lineman with the Roughriders from 1973 to 1976, playing with legendary riders such as running back George Reed and quarterback Ron Lancaster. He returned to the franchise in 2005 as its first full-time president and CEO, a post he held until 2015. So, yeah, it's been a big day. We're going to get to all the other topics. I understand that maybe 99% of our audience don't even know who Jim is. Been a long time since he was even in the role. I don't care. He's in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. He's the greatest leader that I've ever been around, and that's from his induction into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame just a few years ago. He's been on this show multiple times. He meant so much to me. Thanks, Clark, for putting that up. And you know that too, Darren. And the thing is, none of you guys really knew me prior to 2015-ish when I had that life change. But I was softer than baby poo, man. Jim was a guy, along with my dad. When I say greatest leader, my dad's the greatest leader, but I only worked for him on the farm. I was farming. In sports, Jim was the greatest leader. And I just did an interview before we went to air with Global Television, and they asked all these questions like, what do you think of Jim? What do you think of? Well, I think of a lot of things. I think about him being the architect of the decade of decadence, the greatest era in Saskatchewan Roughriders history, 2005 to 2014, 4 Grey Cup appearances, 2 Grey Cup championships. But this is what I think of, not just today, but almost every day or every time that I think of Jim, was him putting me up against the wall in the Rider office, poking me in the chest and saying, we want the best people in every department working for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And that's why we have you here, because we think you're the best at what you do. You're the best radio guy. And I just wanted to go through a wall for the man. He built people up. And the other side, not that it was another side, but it was like he had his thumb on everybody. I was in those meetings back when I used to go into all the team offices. He would go into the marketing people's offices, the accounting offices, the general manager's office, the coach, every day. What are you doing today? And a lot of them didn't like it. Shoot, I didn't like to be held accountable either. He was giving me hell all the time because I was an absolute idiot for a lot of that decade of decadence. But he knew what I was capable of. He knew my potential, and he was always pushing me to reach it. And eventually I did. And when I got into recovery and turned my life around, he had a personal connection to recovery. So he often wanted to ask me, how's that going? How's your life? How are you feeling? Can I help in any way? What more needs to be said about a guy like that? I'm going to start crying here. You don't replace a guy like that, you know? Over to you.
Yeah, no, and I don't know if you can say it much better than that. I mean, I was not nearly that close to Jim Hopson. I met Jim Hopson in person, really, maybe a little bit before when I started doing the local radio show with you a little bit and doing In the Huddle, but really got to know him when he would come and do our show. When we started back in Regina in the studio, he would come in. And he would come early. He would spend extra time. He wanted to know all about you and all about me and what I had going on and this whole thing. And how did this studio come about? And how did this show start? And wow, you really got something here. And then every time I saw him in a public appearance, at a Rider game, at a Rams game, anywhere in the community, he always came over, asked how you were, asked how I'm doing, how everything's going. Just a good human being. And the one thing that stands out for me with Jim, you mentioned, the decade of decadence and the excellence. When Jim walked into a room, you always knew something that was special, and he carried himself in a way that was very professional, yet it was very warm and inviting. He always looked great, no matter if he was casual or professional or in a suit or not. That goatee was always razor sharp. He was always looking great, always had that textbook smile on his face, and he's a part of our show and our history, and we'll miss him.
Oh, huge. And out of all of that, when I say the greatest leader, if you didn't like him, he didn't give a spit. He didn't care. He fired a lot of people that are still mad at him. I get that. But he was great to me. He doesn't care if you don't like him. And that, to me, is a great leader. And I took that away from it, too. So many of these leaders now don't want to offend anybody. You need to be liked by everybody. He didn't care. This is the way it is. This is where we're going. And if you don't want to get on the back, get on board, get the hell out. And a lot of people did. Right? So, anyways, that's my take of Jim. That's my takeaway. And that's the legacy that he left. And I love it. The passing of Jim Hopson. It is national news in Canada, but I might tell you that he's in a Hall of Fame in the States as well. Jim Hopson, this is the biggest story for me and a lot of my people and our audience. Jim Hopson, the former Saskatchewan Roughriders player who later served as team president of the CFL team, has died. He was 73. He had been battling colon cancer for the last 3 years. Was an offensive lineman with Saskatchewan from 1973 to 1976, where he blocked for George Reed and Ron Lancaster, returned to the team 2005 as its first full-time president and CEO, a post he had until 2015. I could sit here and tell you these stories about this man all day, and I might. But for those that are watching in Saskatchewan right now, go and it'll be on the Global News tonight. They interviewed me from here, so you can laugh at my sunburned nose on the Supper News too, if you want. But they asked me for my thoughts on Jim, what I think about when I think of him, that kind of thing. And we can get to more of that. Sharon's watching in Calgary. She writes in and says, she sent a photo of herself with Jim. She says, Grey Cup 2015 is the photo from Winnipeg. Bought Jim Hopson's book. Rest in peace. His book, you want to know something about Jim Hopson? I got a million stories, as you know, Darren. He wrote that book, a bestseller, with a damn pencil and notepad. That's a fact, not a typewriter. He sat at the end of his dock at Long Lake in Saskatchewan and wrote it by hand. By hand! Who does that? Jim Hopson is a bestseller. Brady writes in. He says, hey, Rod, I just wanted to text in and pay my respects to Jim Hopson. This is the Brady from Saskatoon. He says he revitalized the Saskatchewan Roughriders at a time that we were sinking. He provided Saskatchewan with some of the best years in Rider history. Even after his time with the team, he was a true advocate for the team and our beautiful province. Thank you, Jim, for everything. That's from Brady, which, by the way, I know a lot of our U.S. viewers don't know who these names are. I don't care. You're learning. It's the Rod Peterson Show. Our general manager was Brendan Tammon when we won the Grey Cup in 2013. We were hosting the championship in our stadium, similar to the Buccaneers playing right at Raymond James when they were in the Super Bowl, or had the Raiders made it in Vegas this year. It's a big deal when you're hosting it in your stadium. Jim got in the face of Brendan Tammon and Corey Chamberlain, our coach and general manager, and said, if we don't win, you're fired. Good luck. And gave them all the resources in order to do it, and we did. But I don't think Beeve will mind. Beeve didn't really like, that's the general manager, Brendan Tammon, didn't like having Hopson looking over his shoulder all the time. He didn't tell him what to do. He was just looking over his shoulder all the time. There is a difference.
How about that?
And Brendan said to me, he goes, nobody bleeds green more than that guy. As Hopson walked in, there's a lot of people that love the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Nobody more than Jim Hopson. And I got another one. And then I'll be done, and we'll move on. I told you this would be the day for this. Jim Hopson, in a meeting, one of the many that I was in trouble, referred to me as the Dwight Anderson of radio. I think you're familiar with that story. But I think my boss said, what does that mean? He goes, well, he's a pain in the ass and a major headache for me. But dag nabbit, on game day, there's nobody better. That was from Jim, talking about the radio guy. So anyways, that Dwight Anderson was in a brawl on Dewdney Avenue, August 18th, 2013. Charged with assault, by the way, and beat up a drug dealer. Quite frankly, I thought they should have gotten the keys to the city and a medal. Instead, they got charged with assault for beating up a drug dealer. And we had a game that weekend, the upcoming weekend, and Jim didn't want them to play. Why I was in the team offices, I have no idea. That's just the way things went back then. And he was leaning in the door frame, and he's like, so he always did. He rubbed his goatee. I don't want him to play. And Brendan Taman goes, well, we've discussed it as a staff, and we think they should play. So they're going to play. And Jim's like, well, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but just put me on record as I don't think they should play. And then he walked down the hall, but he let them do their jobs. So when I sit here and say that he had his thumb on him, that's not necessarily a bad. He just wanted to be up on what everybody was doing, but he didn't tell anybody what to do. That happened. What do you think about that?
You know, trust the people that you put into positions to do the job. And if they don't do the job, you find new ones. But you have to bring people in that you believe in. But then you need to trust them and give them the resources, but then get out of the way and let them do the job that they're hired to do. And you do what you're good at. You know, the looking over people's shoulders is one thing. You know, hey, what are you doing over there? You know, what do you got going on today? You know, people don't love to hear that, but it's a fine line between being a micromanager and keeping your finger on the pulse. You know, it sounds like Jim Hopson really walked that line, the fine line, very well, kept his finger on the pulse. And when you think about like who sets the culture, and it's different in every organization, it kind of felt like Jim set the culture a little bit in that decade of decadence, because when we look back on it, we think of, you know, the great names. We think of, you know, Darian Durant. We think of Dressler. We think of Fantuz at times. We think of Gene Mikowski. We think of all these different players, the coaches, everything else. But we also really, really think of Jim Hopson. We see him, and I can see his face standing at the microphone, answering every media question, doing every press conference, and being, for the most part, the face of the team. And he did it in an extremely professional way.
Can I just tell you one more? We had a guy in the office that I was... We had a guy in the office who I was particularly close to. Let's call him, I don't know, Dan. And he went on one date with a cheerleading coach. The next morning, Hopson was in his office, and I was in Dan's office, sitting in his chair. Jim leaned against the door frame again. Danny, don't bop the cheerleading coach. And he left. One sentence. We're going to have fill in the rest. We're going to have a problem if you do, so don't. And that was the end of it, man. Direct. I guess that's the problem that I have with a lot of sports teams and organizations is once I've seen the road which he paved, it's hard to take any other trail. You know what I mean?